This is Eddie Adams.
I'm Bill Allard.
Cotton
This is
candy. I mean, you could reach up and you'd see an elk or something. Oh, God. You know, what could be better than this?
I think from the very beginning of my career, I'm not sure why I felt that I should be able to think this way, because at the very beginning of my career I didn't know very much about anything. But I did have one feeling, and that was that my great hope would be to make photographs for whatever the publisher's needs were that would answer those needs, and yet on the other hand be of a quality that would allow some of those pictures to hang on gallery walls. And in order to do that, ultimately, I have to make those pictures for myself. So consequently, I never think of my editors when I'm working. Never, ever, ever. Or the magazine. And I certainly never, I don't think I've ever done this, not made a picture because I thought, well, they'll never publish that. You can't ever do that. That's self-strangulation. You know, once you do, well, you do that once or twice, and then you're going to start thinking that way, and you're not going to see anymore. I have to develop the ability to be my own toughest critic, and to make these pictures good enough so that I feel good about them. If I can do that, I just think that the publisher can't help but benefit. My first assignment at National Geographic was to go to Lancaster County, Pennsylvania, to photograph the Amish, if possible. I didn't know it, but the National Geographic had sent a staff photographer some time earlier, perhaps the year earlier. He had requested of the Amish bishop, the local bishop, permission to photograph their way of life. And the bishop refused, as he had to, because photography is forbidden in their religion. I wasn't told that the staff photographer had gone and had been unsuccessful, and I think in retrospect that was probably good, because then I had no doubts. I had no reason to doubt. I didn't know anything about it. I drove to Lancaster County. On the way, I stopped in Baltimore and bought a used pair of coveralls and shed the coat and tie that I had. And when I got to Lancaster County, I simply went out trying to meet people that knew something about the Amish and who could point me perhaps in a direction where I could have a beginning with these people. And that's kind of the way it started. I started in an approach that I've followed throughout my career, and that's one that's kind of based on serendipity, where you go out and you kind of wander looking for something and allowing yourself to be able to receive whatever happens. And in many cases, if you allow yourself to that openness, things will happen that far exceed what you had been in search of, which I guess is what serendipity is all about. So I worked on that story off and on in the summer of 1964 and into the fall. It was published, and it became, they say, kind of a landmark for the magazine. It was a little more intimate than their usual stories. When I made pictures about that period of time, I had an editor at National Geographic say, well, you have an awful lot of people looking at the camera. And for some reason I found it curious that he would say that, because I couldn't understand what's the problem. Because I felt that if the people aren't doing anything more interesting, then fine, they can look at me. I don't think I'm looking at the camera, I think I'm looking at me. And I'm looking at them. And we're kind of having an exchange, often without anything being spoken. And yet there is an exchange going on between two human beings. And if I can somehow, if I can make that photograph well enough, you should be maybe able to think that you know a little bit about this person and what he does and what he might like and what his life might be, what he might be like, what the music might even be like that he might listen to. That may be stretching things a little bit, but I think that's the power of photography. I think we're capable of doing that. a photograph of the three Basques, the three men's faces, and they're listening to a poet. They're listening to one of these men that make up a story as he goes along and he sings it. I forget now what they call them. But those are absolutely classic Basque faces. I mean, those are ancient, ancient faces. And I'm right next to them. They're so involved in listening to that man sing. I really love that photograph a lot. Henry Gray was a rancher I met while I was traveling the U.S.-Mexican border by motorcycle in 1970. And Henry then was about, I think, 72 years old. And he was concerned because the government was going to try to get him off of that land that he'd been there for a number of decades, and they wanted to turn it into part of a state park, I think it was. And we were just standing in his living room making his photographs, but in his living room he had this wonderful old stuffed head of a steer, and the hide was cracked along the side of the neck from the heat. And on the wall is a flag, an American flag, but a 48-star American flag, which to me said a lot about Henry Gray. In making photographs, I've always thought that it's akin to putting together puzzles. And all of us are going to put them together a little differently because there's an infinite number of ways in which you can put the puzzle together, some a little better than others. But what it's all about is selection and handling of space. And very often it's a matter of excluding, cutting away the extraneous, getting rid of the garbage, getting rid of the unnecessary. And striving at that same time, I think, for a certain simplicity, which doesn't mean your pictures can't be complicated. And I think over the years, I hope over the years, that I've become a little bit more sophisticated in my ability to handle space. One picture I can think of is the man carrying the load he has on his back and emerging out of the shadows. And this was in a small village that I had photographed in 1981 for the first time. And I made this photograph that I think is so much better than the other ones I'd made before. They were nice. They were even special. But this is the way I was able to put the puzzle together. I don't think I could go back there and ever put it together any better than that. I had one or two lenses that I knew were the lenses I wanted to use to see this particular space. But I'd be constantly making just the finest adjustments in what I was including. I remember that very distinctly, and so often it is literally a matter of inches. You can bend your knees 6 inches and make a totally different picture. So it's a matter of selecting, excluding, and seeing the light. Seeing how the light shapes your images, and seeing how the light either attracts your eye to a certain area or takes you away. It's a combination of all those things. I've had a lot of people ask me, did you use a filter on this picture because there's so much red? Well, I mean, there is so much red. You look at this thing and Stan's shirt is red, the tops of the bar stools are red, the front of the bar itself is red, the curtains are red, and then there's this tremendous blast of light that's coming through the open door, just exploding and throwing that red in every direction. In this case, I think it works very well because those chromed legs of the stools are kind of, they take that kind of explosive light, and it doesn't matter, really, that you have the detail. You don't need that detail. What you need is the feeling of that light. And that's what's true about a lot of these photographs. It's not only the light, you got to get the feeling of the light. A lot of my pictures are done in what I have kind of jokingly called Hail Mary light conditions over the years. We're dealing with color film and slow color film, and in order to make any kind of picture at all, you're going to be using shutter speeds down in what I call the Hail Mary range, which means hand holding a camera at 1/4 of a second or 1/2 a second. even a full second, although that's really stretching your luck a lot. And you have no margin for error. But you can make those photographs. So you can do it with a good amount of practice, hand-holding the camera, propping it up on a beer bottle or holding against the wall, whatever. I'm making those kinds of pictures in that way because it's the only way I can get what I'm seeing. And for some reason, I'm attracted to those dim light conditions. And I sometimes think of that Thomas quote about, at night, the heart comes out like a cat on the tiles. And that's kind of what these pictures are about. I think I'm attracted to the edges of things, to the perimeters of it, to the edges of an event rather than the event itself. I don't care that much about the performance. Very often, rather than photographing that, I would prefer to look at what's going on the outsides of those performances, of those predetermined things. And that, again, is where the serendipity comes in. Because it's around the edges where the surprises are. This picture of rodeo queen candidates down in the belly of the rodeo arena in Oklahoma City. And they're all dipping into this jar of Vaseline so they can put Vaseline on their gums and teeth so that when they go out, they'll smile easy. Help them smile and their teeth will glisten. And the key here, I think, is that almost claw-like hand that's coming in. And again, the gesture. The gestures, the combining of the gestures. This man getting the final wrap of his cape and his hand into the right place. The other man adjusting his cap. And then Key, the other man in the center, who's just for a moment looked up and evidently there's a frayed thread that he's examining. I don't have a lot of near dupes, what they call near dupes, of my best pictures. They tend to be momentary, therefore they're single pictures. In this case, I was photographing down into this valley. The sun had gone down, but we were getting some reflection off the clouds that fell on the road leading to the village, almost like a soft spotlight. And I had my back turned to the road, and I heard this woman calling. She must have been calling her children to come home for dinner. And I heard them go by me, and I turned, and I was using a rangefinder camera, I think. And I made maybe 2 exposures. And one was absolutely nothing. I can't remember if I even still have it, or if I threw it away, or if it's just all blur. And the other one was this picture. And that one child which is key. I mean, it's absolutely key. First of all, she's almost the dead center of the image. And then she's floating. She's not even running. She's floating. She's out there in the air. And I remember thinking, a gut feeling, that if I got the exposure right here, if this picture is sharp, it's going to be special. And I went home and it was there. I have one other picture of this wonderful, kind of bizarre situation where Santa Claus meets the Aborigines out on the southern Australia plain. And the difference between the other picture and this one is so simple and so minor and yet so great. And it's this little finger of the woman is raised in this picture. And to me, and combined with her opened mouth, you don't even have to see her eyes. They're wondering, what the hell is this? And that's so often what we're dealing with in pictures that are special for some reason or other. That it's often related to something as simple as a gesture, an expression, or a gesture, or a movement. This is a picture I don't have near DuPont, and again, sometimes I kick myself and I wonder why. Didn't I realize what a tremendous picture this was going to be? But things happen very quickly in a slaughterhouse, and you can't get in your way, and it's semi-dangerous, and but more importantly, things are constantly changing, they're moving. That animal was probably in that position on the floor for only a matter of a few seconds. And the same with the white pig. I mean, obviously that pig is going to move around. And very true of this one with the hog, with the mixture of the light and disappearance. I think there are situations we go into as photographers. I think war would be one such situation, although I can't speak from experience because I haven't photographed a war. But my slaughterhouse pictures, I think I relate to them as I might relate to photographs of war, because there is an unpleasantness, to say the least, that you're dealing with. And I have a strong feeling about photographs on subjects like that. I really demand something superior of myself, certainly regarding the slaughterhouse. How can I take this beyond a simple shock value? I expect that same thing from people who photograph war or mental illness. Because we go in to tragic, horrible situations, we stay there as temporary observers, and we take away. And then we're gone. And I really expect extraordinary work from people who go into those situations. I'm not saying it's always possible, but the subject matter is there, so I expect you to bring it back. Bring it back, you know. You have to have a story that you really care about. You have to care about what you do to begin with. This sounds so simple, but it's so important. You have to care one way or another. If it may be a story you don't really like the subject, or you love the subject, but you can't be indifferent. Because with indifference, you can forget about doing superior work. The immersion into the subject is probably key to my work. I just try to immerse myself. Become, if you will, in some situations, maybe almost a part of the environment or a part of the story. That would have certainly been true with the American West, where for a period of about a dozen years I kind of played at being a cowboy. Very often in the cowboy work, I would work from horseback, even though it would be easier to get from point A to point B in a four-wheel drive vehicle. But I couldn't always get as close to the subject and become as much a part of it. So I try to immerse myself completely in a project. Come up maybe occasionally for air, go back to the geographic, or go back home and look at what I've done. And try to analyze what I've done, try to figure out why am I making the same damn mistakes, you know, and why didn't I see this better? There is a quote by Joseph Conrad that I've often thought about. And the quote is, "No work is ever finished. It's merely abandoned." And I think of that in terms of my work in the American West, which had me, which was a love affair that lasted about a dozen years. But I reached a point that I felt I certainly didn't feel finished. You're never finished with anything, really. But I had to abandon it. I had to go where I was forced to see different kinds of things, and the things would be fresher. In my case, I gravitated south into Costa Rica, into Mexico, into Peru. And it became, for one thing, certainly a whole different range of color, a different palette than I was used to in the American West. I remember being in Oaxaca, Mexico. It's just a color binge. I mean, it was just incredible. And I'd see these things, and they show up in some of my Mexican work, something I came to think of as the coincidence of color, which I've never seen anywhere else. But I'd be walking on a street in Oaxaca, Mexico, and there would be a car of a particular hue parked next to a wall that was a variation of the same color, and down the street would come a woman who was wearing a dress that had little accents of the same color, and she was carrying a basket that repeated that same thing. Incredible. Very coincidental. And I'm not even sure I saw them. Fortunately, I was working in Polaroid at the time so that I could go back to my room and I could look at those things every night and start to be aware of that. Peru is a difficult, harsh country, high adrenaline country, and in ways a brutal country. And I think some of my photographs, I feel very sure that many of my Peruvian photographs carry that aspect. I didn't think about that at the time. I rarely go out, and I don't, maybe this is a weakness, but I rarely go out making a photograph thinking this photograph will say this about that. I don't think of it that way. On the other hand, it's not simply a matter of saying, well, I'm going to go out and take this chunk of space and think of it only in terms of design and color. I've been told, rightly or wrongly, that one of the strengths of some of my work is that it has the element of design, the strong graphics, but with content and with the human emotion left in. And I'd like to think that's true, but I can't, in all honesty, say that I go out and consciously pursue that. I'm not a cause photographer, if you will. And yet I think my photography is concerned with the human condition. And I can think back even now, and I can still remember little Eduardo, a boy of 8 or 9 who was taking sheep home. A driver came along the highway and crashed through his band of sheep, killing half of them, maybe 6 or 7 out of a dozen. And seeing the face of that boy and seeing the way he was dressed in his patched clothing and the tears on his face, and knowing what a tremendous tragedy this was to Eduardo and to his family. Their economy being cut in half, and he being responsible, and he feeling just shattered. And I made my photographs, took my photographs as we do, because we intrude and we take. And I went my way, didn't pay him anything. Went back home after the first trip and saw that photograph and felt very strongly that that was an important photograph, maybe the most important photograph I'd made. And they did use the picture, and to my amazement, and I think everyone's surprise, the response from readers was extraordinary. They started sending in money, unsolicited. Maybe $7,000 were contributed. They replaced the boy's sheep. The rest of the money went into a fund for Peruvian school children. And one of the things about that photograph that is important to me is probably, it relieves my guilt, if you will, because I do take. And very seldom do I give back anything. But this picture made a difference. It didn't stop a war. It didn't, change the human condition. But it actually made a difference in someone's life. And that's very special to me. I've been lucky, very, very lucky in the sense that I probably love what I do in the sense of making photographs as much now, if not maybe even more, than when I started. I've never reached a point where I felt I wanted to go into another area or another field that relates to what I do. I've never felt I wanted to make film. I want to continue to make still photographs because I think the still photograph is still a very valid medium in which to work. It's very important to me to add work. And it's at the same time, it's equally important to be critical enough so that I don't add work unless it is really, it really warrants being put into that body of work, the stuff you really care about. You have to care about everything, but you learn from your mistakes and you try to be so self-critical that the ones you consider successes, somehow you feel confident that they really are.